Bill, welcome to Hub Dialogues. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Great to be here.
So we recently passed a horrible anniversary, which is the 3-year anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russia's apparently lost something like 1 million men to death and being wounded. Ukraine, something like 450,000 killed or wounded. In your mind, are we any closer to peace in this conflict?
Sadly and tragically, we are not. Vladimir Putin has no intention of stopping this war. His objective is the full invasion, I should say, the full capitulation of Ukraine. And he has no intention of doing anything other than that. And so all this talk about ceasefires and the end of the war and setting up peacekeeping forces is all fantasy. This war is nowhere near ending. Vladimir Putin doesn't care whether he's lost 1 million men or 10 million men. He's going to carry on with this war because this war, for him, is the only way to stay in power. And if for some reason he were to lose power, he would probably die. And so from his perspective, this is a war for personal survival.
A few days back, in a very surprise move, the Ukrainians launched 100 kamikaze drones into Russia. They were hidden in the back of trucks, retractable roofs exposed them. These trucks were parked next to airfields and ended up taking out something like 20 to 40 Russian aircraft. I'm interested in what you make of the attack. Was this, a Ukraine with a lot of fight left into them, using some ingenious technology here, or is it, what critics would say, an inventive sort of last gasp exhibition from a country that unfortunately is ultimately may have to submit in this meat grinder of a war to an enemy that is just larger than them with a larger army?
Well, so we've talked about Putin. Putin doesn't want to give up this war because for him, it's a war of survival. It's also a war of survival for the Ukrainians. If Ukraine were to submit, if they were to surrender, then Russia would occupy Ukraine. And we know what happens when Russia occupies parts of Ukraine. Remember Bucha? This was the town near Kiev that was occupied briefly. And while it was occupied, all the women in the town were raped, the men were tortured and killed, and the children were kidnapped. And so for the Ukrainians, if they were to surrender, they would suffer that fate. And so for them, this is a war of survival. And so they're ready to do everything and anything to not surrender because the alternative to surrender is even worse. The alternative to surrender is, I should say, surrendering is even worse than fighting, than being at war. And so you have a situation where both sides are not going to give up. The launch of this Operation Spiderweb, the drones that took out the long-range bombers, was just one of many ingenious ways in which the Ukrainians, with far less resources, have been able to achieve unbelievable military advantage. I mean, there's another one, which is that Russia has effectively no more navy that's capable of fighting Ukraine in the Black Sea. They have a navy, but the navy is all out of reach because the Ukrainians, who don't have a navy, have used drone boats and all sorts of other things to destroy all sorts of Russian ships, and so the Russians are afraid. We're now more than 3 years into the war, and Russia still doesn't have air dominance. The Israelis established air dominance in Iran on day one. And so there's no end to this war. The Ukrainians aren't going to have to submit. The Russians are not going to back off. And you've basically got this unbelievable, terrible stalemate in which I don't see any reason why it won't carry on. And tragically, a lot more lives will be lost on both sides.
Let's talk about Putin, a man you know all too well. You've said that he is no longer trying to win the love of his people. What do you mean by that?
Well, so there was a time in Putin's history as a leader where he had both a carrot and a stick. And the carrot was good economics over some period of time. The people were actually getting better off in Russia, mainly because of higher oil prices. And to the extent that people were bothering him, he would then use the stick, being an authoritarian. But as time has gone on, as the war has ground people down, as the economy of Russia has become worse and worse, he no longer has that carrot. And so all he has is a stick. And so he's in a place where people are not, running around saying, God, Putin is a great leader. People are running around saying, oh my God, if I say anything bad about this guy, I'm going to go to jail or perhaps get killed. And so even though Russia has lost, either through death or disability, 1 million soldiers, and by the way, those soldiers have wives and mothers and sons and fathers who have all mourning their loss, those people are too afraid to say anything. And for 1 million lost, there's probably 15 million people who are very profoundly directly affected by this war, but nobody is speaking up because they're all too afraid. And so Putin is now effectively not running just an authoritarian state, he's running a totalitarian state.
One person that frustrates Putin is you. I know you've described yourself as his number one enemy. Are you sure that you still occupy a place in his mind, or has Zelensky taken that place from you?
Well, I think I'm his number one foreign enemy, and absolutely Zelensky is higher up on the list, and so was Alexei Navalny while he was still alive. Mm-hmm. And there's probably a few other people that Putin really dislikes with a strong passion. But among the Westerners, my role in getting the Magnitsky Act passed, which freezes the assets and bans the visas of Russian human rights violators, is something that Putin found to be absolutely unforgivable. And for a number of years, when he wasn't at war, I was right at the top of the list. And he really went to great lengths to try to find a way of destroying me, because for him, money is more valuable than human life, and I had threatened his money.
So those were sanctions against individuals. I just want to talk about, sanctions ballooned, in Russia when this full-scale invasion happened. As it relates to their economy as a whole, I believe the country's the most sanctioned country in the world. 70% of assets within their banking system now under sanctions. 2/3 of their foreign reserves are frozen. They're excluded from the SWIFT bank-to-bank payment network. There's an oil export ban. You were once Russia's largest foreign portfolio investor. We were told that sanctions like this would cripple Russia, that they would be brought to heel. It's been 3 years now. There's a lot of people that don't understand economics that are scratching their head and wondering, how have they gotten through this? How are they still soldiering on? How are they still making territorial gains, Bill? What's the answer?
Well, it's very simple, that all those sanctions that you mentioned are devastating. There's no question. They really have put Russia on its knees economically. But there's one big loophole, an elephant-sized loophole, and that is that while all this stuff is going on, Russia still has the ability to sell oil. They sell oil to China, to India, to Turkey. They refine that oil. Some of that oil ends up coming back to Europe. The oil that they're selling generates hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue for Russia, for Vladimir Putin, for his war machine. And so because of their ability to sell oil, and because of the West's reluctance to stop them from selling the oil, Russia produces 10% of the world's oil, and if one were to take 10% of the world's oil out of circulation with the same amount of oil demand, the price would go skyrocket, go up to $200 a barrel or some horrible number. And in a world where we're all terrified of inflation for good reason, governments have decided that they don't want to touch the oil, or, well, they'll touch the oil, but they don't want to stop the oil, I should say. And as a result, Putin continues to get the money that he needs to continue fighting the war. Now, I wouldn't characterize him as making huge territorial gains. If you look at the amount of territory that Russia has gained since the beginning of, or since I should say in the last 2 years, it's de minimis. And
what is it, Bill? It's like 1/5 of the country they control, something like that, not even a quarter. Yeah.
Well, it's 1/5 of the country, but most of that was obtained in the first moments of this war. Since then, they've not gotten any more. The Ukrainians have figured out how to hold them back. And so if you look at it over the course of the last, let's say, 24 months, and you were to take their progress, which they have been making some progress, but if you take their progress and you were to say, how long would it take them to get all of Ukraine at this rate, it would be like 115 years. And so this is not some unbelievable superpower that has the ability to just take what it wants. And in doing so, they're losing hundreds of thousands of soldiers. And so it's not a particularly effective war machine that Russia has. They just have Putin has one superpower, which is he just doesn't care about the loss of life, about the personal tragedies that he's creating. He just doesn't care. It doesn't matter to him. It's completely indifferent.
Bill, there was a Soviet mantra that said, at a minute's notice, the civilian economy and society needed to be upended and turned into a society and economy that supported a war effort. Is that what Putin's done? He's basically put the entire country on war footing, that civilians and workers, everyone is servicing this war that's been going on for 3 years, this slog?
Yeah, exactly. So the money that they get from all this oil exports is then put into buying or making tanks and guns and bullets and so on and so forth. And the people who are working, to the extent that there's full employment, are working in these factories. A lot of people have left the country who didn't want to die in the meat grinder, 1 million young, able-bodied men. And so they have an economy, but it is, as you say, a war economy. It's not an export economy. They're not exporting their gas to Europe. They don't make anything that anyone wants to buy. And so the economy sort of chugs along in this weird sort of national emergency type of way. But this is not a good situation. It's not a sustainable situation. And they're drawing down whatever savings that they have access to. They have a national, what they call rainy day fund, and 2/3 of their rainy day fund has now been drawn down, and they'll probably be burning through that by the end of this year. And so this is by no means sort of a humming economy that's got no problems. Now, Putin likes to present it as such because he then looks back at us and says, "Look, I'm doing fine. Why are you hurting yourself with these sanctions? You should just lift them." But the truth is that he's absolutely suffering and desperate to lift these sanctions.
At the same time, I'd like to call out some folks that have been complicit in this, and I'm interested in your thoughts, because I'm just dumbfounded as someone who's not an expert in this, in terms of how they've been able to circumvent certain sanctions. By doing more business with China, 70% increase in trade turnover between 2021 and 23. Doing more business with Kazakhstan and Turkey, which is a NATO member. They've been exporting crude oil through a shadow fleet of hundreds of vessels. 1,700 Western multinationals continue to do business in the country. U.S. semiconductor giant Intel and IBM products have been trafficked to Russia to be used on the battlefield, reporting that U.S. sniper ammo has been found in Russian rifles. Bill, is this not like an indictment of certain folks in the West who are supposed to be a part of this international effort to push back on Russia hard?
Absolutely. It's shameful any Western company or country that's actively involved in supporting Russia in this war. I would say, though, a lot of those examples you're talking about are not from our side of the world, but they're from China and India and Turkey and various places like that, who are definitely not on our side in this whole thing. And so, if you have Kazakhstan, they're just sitting there. They're not part of the sanctions regime. They're not doing any of that kind of stuff. And if we really wanted to be effective in our isolating Russia, there's one easy way to do it, which is to say that the most important countries of the world are imposing sanctions on Russia. And you, let's say, an Indian refinery, if you want to do business with Russia and buy their oil, that's great. But we're not going to buy any more oil from you anywhere in the most important parts of the world if you do that. And guess what? If we were presenting that choice to them, everyone would choose us. That's how it works. That's money makes the world go round. And if we actually, flexed our economic muscles, then all this stuff would stop very quickly.
So it's about applying more pressure to these allies that have come forth and basically given Russia a leg up, allowed them to rely on others that we should be doing.
definitely.
You mentioned your lawyer and friend Sergei Magnitsky, who was arrested in Russia, tortured, killed in custody in 2009. You swore to go after the people involved. That's, how you find yourself here today. You introduced Magnitsky laws around the world, which, like you said, allows people to go after individuals, sanction foreign nationals who've been involved in human rights abuses, corruption, etc., freezing their assets, imposing travel bans. Canada passed its own version of this in 2017. I remember, I believe you came here around that time. I'm wondering if you've spoken to new Prime Minister Carney about this, and if you feel that the legislation here has been used to its full extent.
Well, I haven't spoken to Prime Minister Carney about this since he's been Prime Minister, but I've been in contact with him and friendly with him before he was Prime Minister, and I know for sure that he read my book, Red Notice, because he complimented me on it when we bumped into each other in Davos, and I think he's fully aware, particularly because of his role at the Bank of England before he moved back to Canada, about the power of these sanctions. He's been in the job a relatively short period of time. I think that he's got all the right instincts. I'm a big fan, and I'm sure that in a world where there's a lot of necessity for leadership, I'm sure he can certainly play that role. So it's early days in the Carney regime, but I've got high hopes.
I'm sure you were disappointed, as were others, coming out of the G7 when there wasn't a communique delivered, condemning Russia and their war in Ukraine. Though, is it more difficult than it was years prior to, even get the West to keep this conflict top of mind?
Well, it's. This is the $1 trillion question. I mean, the United States of America under Donald Trump have basically changed the entire approach towards Russia. And of course, the United States was always the most harsh, kind of adversary of Russia, and now they're not. The United States under Donald Trump is aligning themselves with Russia, and it's a completely new world. It's a very difficult world, particularly for someone like me who's always relied on the United States to be the leader in this area. I got the Magnitsky Act in the United States passed in 2012. The next country that passed it was Canada in 2017, 5 years later. Then the UK in 2018, EU in 2020, Australia in 2021. The US led and everybody else followed. Now we're in a situation where the US has sort of switched sides, and to get everybody else leading, it's a lot tougher. And I think that we're in for a pretty rough ride going forward. We're only 6 months into this Trump presidency. Putin shows no indication that he's ever going to back down. And so I think it's going to be a very difficult time going forward for all of us who are standing on the side of Ukraine and all of us standing against Vladimir Putin.
Because this is what I was wondering, Bill. Like, the Trump administration comes in, they've suspended the enforcement of something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the Corporate Transparency Act. They've disbanded something called Task Force Kleptocapture. This is an interagency unit set up to enforce sanctions and seize assets of Russian oligarchs. Are you not worried that Trump could push back against your efforts as it relates to Magnitsky laws in the U.S.?
Well, the one good thing about the Magnitsky Act is it was passed as an act of Congress. It's not an executive order. And so Trump would have to get 51% of the senators and members of the House of Representatives to vote against it, to repeal it. That's never going to happen. It's just not possible. However, Trump could certainly not add any people to the Magnitsky list, and I'm sure he won't. The more horrifying possibility is that he might take the people who have been sanctioned under the Magnitsky Act and relieve them of those sanctions. And if that were to happen, I think it would be a real travesty. But he's got a lot of other fights to fight. I don't know where this ranks in his order of preference. So I'm still hopeful that the Magnitsky Act and the people sanctioned under the Magnitsky Act are not part of his total break the world program.
What do you make of this phrase that was tossed around years ago that Trump is a Russian asset? Other folks would say this is sort of conspiratorial exaggeration in terms of that connection being that tight, in terms of actually being able to influence his actions, Putin being able to do this. What do you make of that accusation launched towards him?
Well, we don't know why Trump is doing what he's doing. But what we do know is what he's doing. And Trump is siding with Putin. Trump, at the G7 meeting, chided all the other G7 members for kicking Russia out of the G8. And by the way, none of the members of that meeting were even in power when that happened. And then he blamed the invasion of Ukraine on Russia being kicked out of the G8, which, of course, the reason why it was kicked out of the G8 is because Russia actually invaded Ukraine in 2014. It's Trump has sided with the United States has sided with Russia, Iran, North Korea on UN resolutions condemning the invasion of Ukraine. And then, of course, there was the most horrific behavior in the Oval Office where Trump and J.D. Vance attacked Zelensky. Why are they doing this? I don't know, but they're doing this. And I think we need to kind of wake up and say, this is really happening. And it's, we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that somehow Trump is going to come around. He's not.
But he also said, Bill, I remember a few days ago after a particularly horrific attack on Kiev where civilians died, that Putin was absolutely crazy, and he called him out for that. How do you make sense of that, these two things existing at once?
Well, first of all, Trump says a lot of stuff, but what he does is what's most important. There was no he didn't then sponsor a resolution at the UN condemning Russia. He just said some stuff. He didn't supply more weapons to the Ukrainians to fight back. And for what it's worth, why did he do that? I think that there's a lot of Americans that are still on Ukraine's side that are against Putin. Most Americans. I think there's a lot of Republicans. Some of his closest allies, like Lindsey Graham, are on Ukraine's side. And so I think he was throwing them a bone, and so it didn't look so obvious. But, if you look at what Trump does, not what he says, he's on Putin's side.
I want to read you something that was written in The Atlantic a few days ago by a journalist named Andrew Rifkin, and you can tell me what you think about this theory. Whatever the intent, Washington has robbed the Kremlin of its North Star, opposition to the United States. After years of routinely threatening to drown the eastern seaboard, Moscow can no longer afford the luxury of calling America its enemy number one. Thanks to Trump, the Kremlin now has to portray Washington as a rational negotiating partner, even as American-made missiles continue to rain down on Russian troops. The Russian propaganda machine has some flexibility, but being locked in an existential struggle with the Netherlands is far less flattering to the imperial mindset than going up against the world's leading superpower. What do you make of that idea?
Well, I look at it from a different perspective, and I say that Vladimir Putin was totally isolated. The United States, the European Union, the G7, Japan, Canada, etc., were all supplying weapons to Ukraine, funding Ukraine, and giving Putin an absolute hard time. And it was really a difficult situation. The sanctions were biting, the troops were dying, and all of a sudden, this is the total Hail Mary out of nowhere. The United States has changed sides. It's no longer supplying Ukraine with military aid, and I think that what propaganda, this propaganda, that doesn't really matter. What matters is that Putin his back was against the wall, and it doesn't feel like his back is against the wall right now. I think he's dancing the jig in the Kremlin right now because, in all the history of the Cold War, there was never a situation where you had a U.S. president behaving like this.
A couple of last questions for you. Are you aware if there are any efforts to raise money to rebuild Ukraine once the guns fall silent, whether that's after a war is won or after some sort of peace accord is signed? Like with a lot of the conflicts going on in the world right now, there's going to be rubble that's going to have to be cleared and buildings that are going to have to be built. Do you have a sense of what those efforts could look like in Ukraine?
Well, the very first effort will be to confiscate the Russian $300 billion of central bank reserves, which is frozen in the West. I've been advocating for that money to be confiscated before the end of the war so Ukraine can defend themselves, so that there is a country when it's all over and there's less rubble. So far, the powers that be don't see that as the best course of action. I think they will as time goes on, but that money is certainly a good place to start. And then I think that when this is all over, Russia should pay for it. Russia should pay war reparations. They're the ones who destroyed Ukraine. They're the ones who should pay for it. I suspect that we're not going to be in a position to get any money out of Russia, so it's going to be a joint effort of the West to do that.
And what's your message to folks, both when it comes to funding this conflict, helping Ukraine, and helping with the rebuild, who seem to believe, and both here in Canada, some of them would say, this is a foreign conflict, it doesn't affect me, we have our own problems in this country that we need to address. This is on a part of a map in which it has places that I can't even name, and therefore I don't care. What do you say to those folks?
Well, I'd say to Canadians that you're on the front line. Canada's, you're on the Arctic. Russia wants the Arctic. They'll come down from the north if you're not careful. You should be very happy that the Ukrainians are the ones doing the fighting right now, and that no Canadians are dying, because if Russia gets Ukraine, they're going to start moving on other places, and nobody is immune from this thing. It may seem like a world away, but I don't think it's that far away for anybody.
Last question. I'd like to end on a quote from my favorite author, Belarusian journalist Svetlana Alexievich. In 5 years, everything can change in Russia, but in 200, nothing. What do you think of that quote?
Well, I think that we're sort of seeing that right now. This, as Stalin said, one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. Here we are with 1 million deaths or disability from this war, and it all feels like a history repeating itself. And I do think that there's something inherently painful about the Russian situation, where they just keep on bringing hardship on themselves, and they don't seem to see any way out of it. I wouldn't disagree with her.
That's Sir Bill Browder, CEO of Hermitage Capital, head of the Global Magnitsky Justice campaign. Bill, thank you so much for joining us on Hub Dialogues today.
Thank you.